said, I lead climate innovation at BCG within our digital technology branch. But my current sort of research passion is the topic of deep design. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about two sides of the coin, designing for and designing with responsible AI. So I think when we look at this kind of where I sit in the world and how I wear many hats within my role at BCG and more broadly, my background is theoretical physics. I specialized a lot in complexity science. So I'm very driven by looking at things from an emergent kind of lens and understanding the radical interdependency of societies, economies, etc., which I think in the AI context is becoming ever more urgent to advocate for. And then also I've got experience in design and kind of the digital products and services lens, but moving more towards a kind of a transition aperture of design, which I'm going to talk a bit about today. And then in the context of AI, looking at kind of the future of a collective intelligence for designing with AI. So the two sides of responsible AI, there's designing for more trustworthy AI. So that's looking at AI for society, addressing sort of data coloniality, and also looking at new research cultures. But then there's the other side, which I want to get into, which is more how do we use AI for systemic change? And this is kind of the bleeding edge of AI innovation at the moment, is better understanding from a systems lens, distributional impact, not just sort of aggregate impact. And also how do we encode societal values when we look at broader applications of AI that are beyond more narrow kind of human-human scope. So if I start with sort of this idea of what we typically talk about human in the loop for. So there's a lot of research around this need to expand the aperture of talking about society in the loop. So this is beyond sort of just this human oversight of a very uncontested example of AI. I think a good example for on the left would be something, let's think of like an airline pilot, right? Overseeing the autopilot of a plane for the general safety of the passengers. It's not that easy, obviously, as we know in society. We need such broader ways of encoding societal values and kind of shifting towards often conflicting goals and values within society. So the heterogeneity of stakeholders is ever more complex. So we need to sort of land on an ethics for how we look at AI in more societal and broader contexts, a nice challenge. So some of the things that I'm musing about recently, and I think it's really important when we look at kind of the AI conversation, is a lot of this is already before you get to sort of data ethics, AI ethics, we're looking at the origins of sort of data ethics here. And there's been a lot of recent sort of momentum, I think, around this in terms of this idea of social quantification through data, right? We're in this interdependent sort of information ecology that's ever growing, ever more pervasive. And we're having these data relations that are creating sort of a new capitalism, a new social order. And I know my fellow panelists are going to have really interesting perspectives on this from a more ethics domain. But I think things to really reflect on, and we might get to this in the discussion today, is how that's bleeding obviously into things like the stability of democracy. I think this is a very, very tangible one in the data economy. The emergence of sort of false consensus and misinformation is a really interesting one. But what I'm interested in also is how do you kind of compound that, you know, data ethics view with the need for how we design with data. So as a designer, everything now is about data manipulation, right? And AI is an example of this. And what's really interesting is this switch from sort of the product service paradigm as well to sort of the vast systemic change that we need when we're looking at the poly crisis, climate change, the deepening sort of economic recession. These are big interconnected challenges, and we need to look at radical change. It's no longer, unfortunately, evolutionary change. So the design community is talking more about this idea of transition and understanding that through design, we are essentially world building, but within the constructs of sort of the Anthropocene, we're building sort of one world. We're not building multiple futures for different civilizations. So I think it's interesting to think about the connection here between data and designing this idea of ways of being in the world. So that's something. And something that I've been speculating on generally is the need for more sort of countercultures when we look at this idea of the data economy. Data is the new oil, for example. And there's this idea that if you look at sort of those very capitalistic sort of data relations that are entrenched in the way we think and the way we exist today, how could we look at a more ethical data relation to one another and within society? So this idea of maybe like an ecological shift that's not so extractive for economic expansion, but potentially for regenerative ecological preservation. And what does an ecology of scale look like to sort of counter this idea of the economies of scale, where you increase volume, you reduce kind of unit cost? How about increasing diversity of representation through data, and also looking at new propensity models that actually share the value of what that data's gone on to create back to the people that provided their data? So a recent speculation that I think has a big calling for kind of a new design rhetoric. And decolonial AI obviously is from the origins of this. So how do we take that data coloniality and then look at sort of the semantic discontinuity that happens when you aggregate that data and when you obviously use it within algorithms for decision making? So there's been some seminal work around a lot of the teams at DeepMind on this. A particular paper really got my attention that was looking at the need for kind of new research cultures as using decolonial approaches to the development, but also deployment of AI. And they looked at particular sites of coloniality being kind of within the decision system themselves, but also largely this idea of ghost work. So when you're kind of doing data labeling and all that kind of pre-processing, that is often done out of context, right? Without the domain context for where that algorithm is going to be distributed. So there were some really clear-cut, interesting examples that were starting to sort of codify the size of the challenge in addressing kind of AI in the society context. So I found that very inspiring. And also over the weekend, I was reading an article by one of the data scientists from the United Nations. You may know him, some of you, Miguel Luengo-Uroz. And he said we forgot to give neural networks the ability to forget, which I find superbly interesting. And any Blade Runner fans might notice this image. It's kind of a bit of a geeky one, I guess, but kind of Deckard obviously is always contemplating this idea that, you know, Hari's memory is implanted. And I think it's a really interesting point is, you know, we're building all of these neural nets and deep learning algorithms, but what about when you want to retract the data that you've given to one of the parameterizations of this model, and you don't want it to be considered in sort of the aggregate learned behaviors? So this idea of like deep unlearning is something that I think is going to be getting a lot of attention. And how does this contribute also to things like, I think there's a word going around called forgetful advertising as well, which looks at, can you actually retract data you've given to sort of social media that has tailored sort of the advertisements that you're seeing? I mean, a super like complex problem is, how do you retract data points that a model's been trained on? So something that got my attention over the weekend that I just found really fascinating. What's also happening is, I think from a complexity perspective, the approach we've sort of currently got to AI is very singular, right? We're looking at it as a sort of super intelligence that's very monolithic. Whereas in nature, when we look at intelligence, and I've used the example here of like a swarm of birds, like, so I think murmurations are quite tangible to everyone, but we see this sort of self-organization of ecosystems of intelligence, which is not how we're building AI, which is quite unusual. And neuroscience has obviously set the course for a lot of the kind of the deep learning research. But I think what's interesting now is this reorientation towards this idea of shared, or if you want to call it collective intelligence, and whether that potentially has within it some new design patterns for ethics, and how we might see the interdependency of different forms of intelligence coming to play. And I think the question that was posed in this recent paper was really interesting. We need to move away from sort of the, I guess, look at how does intelligence present to us as researchers, more to what is it that intelligence must be, given that intelligent systems exist in a universe like ours. So if I shift gear a little bit, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try and speed this up, Ben, but other side of the coin now is, well, what's the huge opportunity that we also gain through the ability to, I guess, disclose hidden dimensionality through AI? And I think the theme of today's panel is seeing the unseen. So I think this is quite a nice way to frame it. But something I've been doing some research on recently is this idea of deep design. And this is really kind of a, I guess, convergence of different approaches. So coming from sort of a complexity background, that we can't just model everything, for example, the economy, as being homogeneous. It's made up of many heterogeneous agents of different beliefs, different values, different goals. And typically our economic models are run on the idea of a representative agent, right? So we don't actually model for the difference in society. So complexity gives us an ability to codify a simulation based on heterogeneity and how things are interdependent. And then also deep reinforcement learning is able to give us new mechanisms for looking at how we optimize for multiple objectives. So an example I'll use is, how do we look at a fairer tax system where we drive social equality at the same time as maintaining productivity of the state, for example? That's a multi-objective problem, right? Because there's two very different, often conflicting goals. And what reinforcement learning can do is help us understand the trade-offs and also simulate those trade-offs in new ways. And then human-centered design in all of this is very important. If we're talking about modeling an economy, we need to understand the behavioral dynamics that underpin it, but also this idea of mechanism design. So if we want to create, for example, a tax policy that is able to better balance productivity and social equality, we need to do something in the model. We need to enforce the right policies that give that outcome. So it's kind of like a reverse game theory. And I think this is where designers really come to the table on these new sort of AI-based simulations in understanding, well, what do we actually want to achieve? How do we encode societal values in what we're building? So really, it's a deep learning approach to this idea of mechanism design, which is very entrenched in modern economics. And kind of coming back to the framing that I mentioned at the start around this idea of a social contract or a society in the loop mechanism, what this model actually does is it allows you to actually explicate what those values are through the idea of rewards. So I'm sure many on the call are aware of like reinforcement learning, the fact it's reward-based and that it incentivizes agents to maximize rewards. Imagine making that reward the the trade-off of the productivity and the equality of social welfare. You might actually get a dynamic that can get somewhat close to an optimal tax policy. And so briefly, kind of under the hood, I don't want to go too much into the details, but I'm happy to share more offline if you're interested. But it's kind of looking at a two-level reinforcement learning problem, which I think the teams that are doing this is really the bleeding edge of simulation for sort of socioeconomic complexity. But you're basically running a simulation of agents that you kind of codify the goals, constraints of, and the base dynamics around, so like rules of the game. And then you're putting a really intelligent like governance algorithm on the top that can go after the sort of social values that we want to achieve within a given context. So it's kind of a new way of engineering these problems. Big shout out to the teams that are doing this. I think there's a lot of research communities spread across Harvard, spread across Oxford, Salesforce, and many others at the moment. But there was a really interesting one that got in the press quite massively, and rightly so, the AI Economist, which was solving this problem of balancing productivity and social welfare. And this was run in the Americas, and they found that the model actually produced a more optimal trade-off at 16% more than like the US-based tax model. Obviously, the challenge now is kind of putting that into the real world, which I think is the call to action for designers as well, to understand how do we, safeguard the translation of these models into real complex settings. Another research endeavor that I'm involved in at the moment is applying the same mechanism to global climate cooperation. So looking at agents as regions of the world and understanding how do we define better negotiation protocols between countries that gives a net positive gain in terms of reduction in temperature and carbon emissions, whilst not limiting the GDP of the countries. So they're looking at continuing economic growth, but balancing it with meeting the climate transition. And this is a very open community endeavor. There's lots of climate policymakers, anthropologists involved in this. And I think that for me is really where I see this kind of arc of ethicists coming to the table, data scientists, but also domain experts, and many other kind of alternative research cultures, I guess. So I will stop there. I'd be very happy to share more on some of the work that I mentioned as well. I've also started collating some of this in a GitHub. So if you're interested in some of the simulation models in the community that are doing these cool things, please check it out. But otherwise, over back to you, Ben.
There's so much in there. So thank you, Sophia. Some of the things that struck me were this new social order, ghost work and labeling context, unlearning natural intelligence and that comparison, and what values we're encoding, as well as like economic growth and baking these assumptions in to the kinds of algorithms we're making. I'm hopefully we'll get some questions, so please use the question Q&A from the audience and really ask those really important questions. We've got a few coming in right now. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alex Joseph, a data scientist locally and expert in kind of fake news, hate speech, all these amazing things that are happening right now that we should be aware of. So thank you, Alex. Take it away.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Sophia. That was super interesting. Before I get into my sort of quick talk, I'm super interested in this transition from a dominated society to a more ecological society, implementing sort of complex systems, views into the way we build our society. So yeah, would really be interested in discussing that at some point. But yeah, so a bit about me. So I've been working in the online harm space for a few years now. My job has basically been to apply AI to clean up the online environment in various ways. I started my journey working in the misinformation space, looking to combat misinformation in the UK, Argentina, and various locations in Africa. Misinformation is a term that I think most people will be familiar with, especially since the COVID pandemic. But I think people are often surprised at just how much damage it can do. I think one particularly graphic example comes to us from India, Delhi to be exact, where during the pandemic, there were a number of rumors that were proven to be false. That the local Muslim population was spreading coronavirus. And as a result of that, it led to a number of violent attacks where in the subsequent violence, someone actually lost their lives. So misinformation is obviously something we want to crack down on. That was just one example. There are many others. The good news is that there are ways to combat misinformation. Fact-checking has been proven to be one of the best methods against it. Fact checks have been proven to reduce belief in misinformation, and those who read fact checks have been shown to retain factual information weeks afterwards. And this was proven across different political environments, cultures, and countries. So fact-checking is really a tried and tested method. The problem is each fact check can take days to research and then publish. So the challenge really is to speed up fact checking to meet the demands of the social media age, where misinformation is spreading that much faster. I've been building tools to sort of facilitate that. I've done that in a number of ways. Firstly, I've helped build tools to help fact checkers spot misinformation faster, allowing them to get ahead of the curve, so to speak. Secondly, I've helped build tools to spot repetitions of claims that have already been fact checked, allowing a fact checking team to get the most juice out of any one of the fact checks. And then lastly, I've helped build fully automated fact checking systems capable of fact checking macroeconomic claims without any human inputs. Again, a massive time saver there. Moving away from misinformation from a second, but still staying within the sort of online harms space. More recently, I've been focused on the hate speech problem. So, as we all know, social media makes it easy for all of us to express our opinions, our thoughts instantly online. But the problem is when disagreement arises, it can often result in hate speech being directed at individuals or groups. In extreme circumstances, hate speech online can manifest offline, resulting in people being harmed or killed. In a recent study was showing that hateful rhetoric online can make political violence more likely, give violence direction, and increase fear in vulnerable communities. In another study coming out of America, it was showing that hate speech against Muslims led to a 32% increase in real-world hate crimes. So again, like misinformation, hate speech is something that we really want to crack down on, and I've been building hate speech detection algorithms to detect things like racism, sexism, religious hate in online content. And I've been sort of learning just how difficult a problem it is. Hate speech and misinformation, for that matter, is often spread by malicious users. These could be trolls or state-backed accounts, and these malicious users are intentionally spreading this content. And in their sort of aim to spread malicious content, they will do anything they can to evade detection by the algorithms that could be deployed to sort of detect them. They might do things like replace some of the letters in an offensive term with numbers, or perhaps they might write their post in one language, let's say English, and then use offensive terms from another, let's say French. So recently, one of the things I've been thinking about is what AI visibility means in an online harms context, and the ways in which we might approach making these algorithms more transparent, more visible, while still preserving the mystery needed to not give the whole game away and not to sort of empower any malicious user that may be trying to avoid and beat these algorithms. So yeah, thank you. I think that's all from me. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Alex, so much. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the hate speech transferring to the real world, the fact checking, there's some like light and darkness in there, right? So I think hopefully we'll balance that out a little bit later as well and get to, you know, the methods and things that people are doing is really super interesting. So I'm just going to quickly share the poll results from the first poll that we had, which was the interest in AI ethics. We've got lots of people who are using data in their, using AI ethics in their data science work, which is awesome. So it's really nice to see that. Some people who are in an advisory side or consulting, and other people who just have a general interest. No one ticked the ethics washing one, so thank you, everyone. You're not trolling us today, so that's really nice. And we'll put up the second poll in a second as well for you to do that. So our next speaker is Alice Thwaite, and she is an amazing person, a founder of and philosopher at Hattusia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, senior lead for ethics at OMG and OmniGOV. Take it away, Alice.
Hi, everyone. Hi. It's fantastic to be here. And it's also really good to see the results of that poll. When I started in this field, there are very few people on the advisory side of AI ethics or as a consultant. So it's very cool to know that there's at least 15 people in this room who's doing this job. And for that reason as well, I think I can hand on heart say that the caliber of conversation that we're having now around ethics is so much better than it was 2 or 3 years ago. I think when we were in these conversations 2 or 3 years ago, at least when I was there, it was mainly just talking about the fact that, you know, there's two sides to ethics and it's very complicated and maybe we should be thinking about it and that kind of thing. And now to see some amazing research coming through and companies taking this super seriously and actually seeing this as, yes, it is complicated, but so is so many parts of work, right? So is so many parts of labor. An artist, for instance, doesn't just stare at a blank canvas and hypothesize all the different ways that they could go. They just, you know, they start working and they create something. And that's what we're doing now with ethics is, yes, there's a lot of different opportunities out there that are available, but there are frameworks to get started and we are doing better now, I think. At least in this community. I think sometimes when you look at the news, you can feel a bit disheartened. But if you are I don't know, take comfort from this community, take comfort from the fact that this is something which is turning into a profession and it is an established field. So to those people who are perhaps using data, using it for their work, or perhaps looking at this from a general interest point of view, I just wanted to say a couple of words about what the profession is, so that you can think about, whether or not you either want to become an ethicist, or the sorts of questions that you should be asking managers or hiring personnel, so that you can start thinking about bringing these people onto your team. Because ultimately, if you are a data scientist, I'm not saying you shouldn't be thinking about these questions, but you've already got a considerable amount of expertise, right? And to ask you to take on another, degrees worth. I mean, there's people who've spent PhDs 9, 10, 12, 15 years just looking at very specific questions within ethics. I think it's kind of unrealistic to expect you to take on all of that extra work, and instead you should be working alongside people who have these kind of specialisms. So I think Sophia already touched on this really, and Alex gave a flavour of it as well in his presentation. If you are working in the field of ethics, you might have many different specialities and methodologies. So for example, I tend to use the philosophical method in my work. I also have a degree in social sciences, so I'm kind of aware of the social science methods in order to understand information, to make sure that policies are as inclusive as possible, to make sure that we're including a wide range of perspectives on ethics as possible. But there's also historians. I've spoken with people who specialize in English literature, and so looking at literary perspectives on ethics, musicians, artists. There's this phrase called digital anthropologists as well, which I think is really taking off, digital social scientists. So all of these people are people who can help you in your work to understand, how can we push this towards something which is working for society, as opposed to something which has a very narrow objective, which might be around an individual company's profit. And so that is the first thing to say, is that there is going to be so much diversity here, because the range of diversity that exists within social science and humanities is also quite extraordinary. So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is that when we're working in businesses, so you might already have a degree in one of those subjects, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I've already got an anthropology degree or something, or I've already got a degree in international relations. So how do I then transition into something which makes this applicable for the workspace? That's when you start looking at all sorts of different methods as well in terms of business transformation, because essentially what we're asking to do is businesses to transform in a way that they develop AI into something that does prioritize these other metrics, as opposed to just prioritizing maybe that profit motive or something which was a bit more narrow. So you've got to think about business transformation. I use quite a lot of psychological methods in my work as well. Well, actually, that's probably another group of people who would be really good to work alongside as an ethicist, but in ethics. But psychology has such a massive part to play in trying to understand business transformation. And you also need to have a degree of sales skills. You need to have an amazing you have to have empathy with everyone. You have to be able to listen. You have to need to understand, and you do need to sell in and up the value of the work that you're doing. So that's something else to consider when you're thinking about ethics. Is it's not just the case at the moment. I mean, I've said we're established, but we're definitely not developed. We do still need to push the value of what we're doing the whole time back to businesses and the organizations that we're working with. So that's just a bit of a flavor of the sorts of things that you might be thinking about when you're thinking about this idea around ethics. And I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thank you, Alice, for that super succinct and awesome talk. Getting a buy-in almost into AI ethics, how AI tech ethics and data ethics, how it's progressed and over the last few years, and the kinds of people and methods that we can use to all take advantage of, hopefully making this situation better and for society, not just for capitalism. We have another poll, which I'm going to share with you now, before we get to our last speaker. which is to what extent we are using ethics today, using ethical frameworks or processes. Some people are using those. We have many more people talking about ethics internally, which in my books is awesome. Like Alice is saying, you know, we've just come quite far from, and people and businesses are taking notice of this now. So that's really, really good. Not yet started, slightly, you know, on the edge there. We could do something about that. Don't know, not thinking about it. It's interesting. I want to hear from you about like why maybe you are at the starting block. What kinds of things are you worried about, or do you just not know where to start maybe? So that'd be really interesting to, you know, get some more questions from you as well. So we have one more speaker with our lightning talks before we get to our panels. Her name is Dr. Marie Oldfield, AI and ethics expert, senior lecturer, LSE, director of Oldfield Consultancy, mathematician, and much more besides. So I'd like to invite Dr. Marie. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Yeah, quite interdisciplinary, and that's my background really. So my company works in the legal sector with government, with companies, and also my academic background is mathematics, statistics, and artificial intelligence. So in the last kind of few decades, there's been a lot of work on AI and ethics. And the reason that it's not kind of joined up is because philosophers weren't really talking to technical people, which is what kind of happens in these large programs of work. Just let me set my watch so that I know when I need to stop, otherwise I'll talk all over. Okay, so what happens is when we design AI, a lot of the time people develop it and they do it without actually considering what the impact on society is. So when we're developing the model, what happens is the entire conceptual part of the modeling process gets missed. And what that can mean is when we get to putting the model together, we haven't considered what the impact on society, on users, how we're going to develop it ethically is going to be. When we say ethics, just to come back to this point, many people say ethics, don't understand ethics and don't use ethics. So ethics is a really big area in philosophy, and it also spans psychology, it comes into technology, it spans everything because it's part of society. It's kind of how society regulates itself in a way, and it's a method in which we try not to impact society in a negative manner, which, as we've seen over the last few years, especially AI has done in terms of visa algorithms, credit card algorithms. And what's happened there is when we've developed these algorithms, we haven't considered what the data is telling us. And very many people may not interrogate their data well enough. The data reflects society. It's not that you can just put this data into a model and the model will make it look really nice and everything will come out with full diversity implications. Everybody's treated equally. That's not how it works, because the data doesn't work that way, because it comes from society and society is messy. So when we look at the data, we need to consider what it's showing us, what it's telling us. And that's not to say that we need to change the data. It's to say we need to understand it so that when the output comes out of the model, we understand what the output is and how that will affect the decisions on users and on society. One of the more dangerous things to do with that is then to try and automate it, because you've got nobody looking over the top of it and you've automated a decision-making process, and then you might have disadvantaged hundreds of benefits claimants or visa applicants or whoever else is at the other end of the model. Just to quickly, before I go on to my next slide, I wanted to talk about just a tiny little bit about misinformation and disinformation. So to me, these two concepts not only don't exist in a way that they're defined, but they are very harmful. And when we look at things like fact checkers, that can also be harmful. So especially over the last couple of years, academic papers have been completely disregarded because fact checkers that have had no understanding of the academic research have started blocking them. I had to move some of my papers from LinkedIn because they were being blocked, because they were being apparently fact checked. And the content in these papers was from the UK government. So the fact checker was telling me that the UK government was incorrect in an inquiry about itself, which is interesting. So my opinion is that there is information. That information may or may not be relevant to you. You need to be critically thinking about what that information actually means. And then you need to make a discussion, have a discussion about it, and make a decision on it. When we're talking about these types of information use, where we can be talking about how governments use information to use behavioural nudging techniques. So when there are crises like water crises, food crises, or just something that the state wants you to do, or potentially NATO, because they've published on this, they'll use social media in the same way that adversaries use it to come and kind of change your worldview and change your opinion, to try and put you into a group, to try and make you do a certain thing. This is done so subtly, you hardly ever notice it, but it's there, and it's what social media is used for. It's not new, it's been done for many, many decades, especially in marketing as well. And the way that this is done generally is to, and this is, all of this is in my papers if you want to have a look at them, it's on the link in front of you, dehumanization, which is quite a novel area that we're doing academic research in, but it is quite an old area. So what happens is people form groups and they form norms within those groups. And then how brands use that and marketing uses that is by setting groups against each other. And you know, from social media and the media, people are actively set against each other because the way to keep you clicking on things is to make you angry and to make you negative in some way. So that is the most powerful human emotion to be tapping into. So dehumanization is a way in which that does promote violence offline and online. It's a very easy tactic to use. It's been used for a long, long time, and it's something that I've written a lot about because I find it really, really unethical to not only try and sell people in that way, but to get them to group up and to get them to behave in a certain way by engaging in this type of activity. And again, that feeds into the basic fundamental human belief system of wanting to be part of a group or distinct and to appear as though you potentially have more than other people in some sort of way so that you'll join a specific group. There's really good examples of this happening. I think it's in Madagascar in a culture called Fadi, so it's worth looking that up. Okay, so what are the consequences of poorly designed AI? You know, you can kill people with it. You can seriously disadvantage people to the point where they wonder why life's worth living. In my work, the people at the end of my tools can actually die, and I can, you know, that can happen during the duration of the output of the model in some of the instances. So what I try to do is design well and design to keep people alive, not only military, but users, society, to make sure that the impacts are not only looked into, but they are mitigated before the technology goes out the door. And at the minute, I'm designing software alongside LSE that we're going to spin out to look at this, and AI accreditation for AI professionals. Something that was said in one of the last talks as well was not regulation, but guidance. Companies have been looking at ethics for a long time, but in my research where I've done surveys and spoken to companies, because they don't know which regulation or guidance to use or how to find it, what they do is just wait until it impacts their PR. So they do consider it, but not enough to really mitigate any impact of their implementation of technology. And then when their reputation is damaged or they experience financial risk, they might come back and try and do something about it. But they will try marketing first to make their image better than design better in the first place. So that was an interesting result from companies that I spoke to. So who's responsible for ethical AI or AI? I mean, we can say ethics. Can we really define it? Who's responsible for this? It's developers, users, stakeholders, and society. We're all responsible. As we said before, it's about interdisciplinary working and having the right experts in the room. If you don't have them, you can't use them. The UK government inquiries in 2013 into poor modelling that have been going on since the 90s or even before discussed communication, and people weren't communicating correctly. They weren't able to challenge decisions that were made. Modelers weren't able to challenge models. There weren't enough resources. The skills weren't there to build these models. There was no accountability, and the leadership was not helping. So after a huge financial issue with one of the tenders in 2013 that was investigated by the Macpherson review, we had another inquiry by the government in 2020. This is my paper that was getting banned everywhere, that was published in AI and Ethics, where policy became divorced from modelling. Policy was doing things before the modelling even came out, so it wasn't evidence-based. There was a severe lack of interdisciplinary model. There wasn't diversity in the room. The experts weren't there. The experts that were there were not respected in their views. There was hardly any data, so they weren't able to even get the data because the systems were so poor. And this all led to extremely poor modelling. It led to bad outcomes for society. It was particularly bad. And the fact that not only all of the issues from 2013 were found again, but new things were found that were actually impacting the modelling is just shows that everything had gone downhill in the space of 7 years, even though it was bad enough between the 90s and 2013. So how can we do better? All of this is human factors. You might think it's all to do with designing things, but we design things as humans and we put our beliefs and norms into these systems. So we need to include the right people. We need to do conceptual development steps, understand why we're modelling, what we're modelling for, who are we modelling with and why. Address past issues. So don't keep on making the same mistakes that keep coming up in the same inquiries, that are coming up in the same guidance documents. Let's move forward from that and look at what best practice actually is. And if we move forward in an open and transparent manner with best practice, which does exist, it just needs kind of rejigging a little bit for the future use of AI. I've got a paper out there on best practice as well. Then we can move forward in a better way for society and not cause all these issues where we're trying to put people in groups, give them information to behave certain ways, and then do things that are actually having a really bad impact on society when we're implementing the technology at the end of our design. Hope I got through that in time. I hope I wasn't too fast. It's nice to see everybody here today, and thanks for letting me talk. I think that's back to Ben now.
Yeah, I was just waiting for the button to be pressed and for Zoom to catch up with me. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. There's some things that are ringing in my ears. The AI accreditation, you know, how's it going to work? Maybe we could talk about that. It'd be interesting to see what your opinion on that is. The fact that obviously responsibility, accountability, really important, especially when it comes to governments and kind of the overseers of our citizens, as well as harking back to fact checking and the kind of the semantics around AI ethics and ethics generally. What are we talking about? So really, really interesting. I'm just going to spend a quick few minutes just to discuss a few things that I've got kind of rattling around in my brain, and then we're going to open it up. So please do put more questions on the Q&A. I'm pointing that way because that's where I can see them. That would be really awesome. So I'm Ben. I've been running the Machine Ethics podcast for 7 years, and I've been really fortunate to talk to some people who may be on the panel, lots of amazing people who are either really interested in this area, doing things, developing things, or have written books and such in AI ethics and AI's impact on society. And some of the things that really captivate me is obviously the kind of here and now of the situation, working with these models, trying to extract the best outcomes when we're working on these data science pipelines, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with kind of the terminology, taking some idea through to production and creating a new AI service. But there's all these other kind of fringe things like machine ethics, like how do you program ethics and what does that actually mean into a system? There's obviously kind of more transhumanist ideas around like singularity and kind of how this technology is going to change us as humans, as well as just ideas around machine consciousness and indeed human consciousness. As well as like more abstract things like simulation theory and evolutionary AI and all these like fun things around the edges. One of those fun things at the moment, which is just exploding all over the place in my kind of ears and my Twitter feeds and all sorts of things, and I'm sure yours too, this idea around kind of generative AI, image generation, text generation. There's lots of these models out, and it's kind of typified by ChatGPT, for example. And I'm trying to write a long kind of presentation about some of these ideas and what it means for AI ethics and kind of the interesting positives as well as negatives around some of the developments at the moment. And you might have seen things around plagiarism, kind of ripping off someone's style, direct reproduction, so just taking someone's work, whether it be text or images, and just kind of reproducing it. It's very hard to fight against that sort of thing when we ask for specific outcomes. We ask for the Mona Lisa, for example, and it's going to try its best to give us something which is representative of the data. And it's sort of, it's these sorts of things that you might have heard of. But then it's also these other things like the filtering problem. How do you filter bad language, maybe nudity, maybe harmful content when you're presenting it to, it's a service to the general public. You can go and chat to GTP, you can go and use Midway and DALL-E 2 and all these sorts of things right now. And it's interesting to me that, like some of the other lightning talks, a panelist pointed out that we have fact checkers and we have these systems in place that are filtering out information from these systems. And it's interesting that, they have the authority at the moment to take certain things out and not others. So it's checking the checkers, as one of the questions on the chat points out. It's also really interesting to kind of appreciate how we're moving forward with these technologies. How is it going to affect us in the long term? What does these systems actually mean for how we're going to live our lives in the future? And one of the things I've been kind of playing with at the moment is that we have these interactions where we type into a computer or we move a mouse around, and these are kind of or maybe scroll, maybe just scrolling. Maybe our most interactions are scrolling these days. Maybe I'm wrong, it's just scrolling. And we've got this new interface, right? We thought we had it with Siri and all these other kind of chat interfaces, but they were taking our information and doing some searches and cobbling together some answers. With this, we're taking kind of our information and we're putting it into some latent space and transforming that into, what is the next thing that we want to hear. The things that we see in the image generation, say Midway is the one I've used the most extensively. You're taking that kind of textual information that it could be vocal information, and that's getting transformed into, again, this latent space and getting pumped into a image generation. I'm waving my hands around, sorry, but image generation part of this larger network. And it's just really interesting to me what those other things are going to be. So you could just take that image part out and transplant it with something more like some sort of computer-based diagnosis system. So you could ask your large computer network, how are you today? And it would be able to kind of put that into latent space, pick up all the logs that it has, all the things it's been tracking, and give you a natural language output. And that is a way that we could interact with computers. But it might not be just computers, it might be robots, and it might be robots that's in our house, and it might be robots that are able to interact with us with language and tell them about themselves. And these are the sort of things which will be happening, and I think it's very interesting. And I'm yet to kind of find the edges of the situation, but I just thought I would put some of these things I've been thinking about out there, but do check out more of that sort of thinking on the podcast and on all these different places that you find more information, especially around AI ethics. So with all that kind of all that said, thank you very much to all the speakers for presenting such great kind of wealth of different types of areas and information. If I could call you all up, and we can start with a starter for 10 question, if that's okay. So if you could put your cameras on, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hello again.
Hi. So I've got one which is very close to my heart, and I think I'll probably start with you, Alice, and then we can move on to anyone else who wants to pitch in, which is around this idea of kind of buy-in for AI ethics. If you're working in a company, how do you kind of think about, maybe you're not doing anything in this area at the moment, but you would like to have some buy-in in a company? and maybe where's the place to start, and maybe the kinds of things that you might be doing as a stepping stone kind of process and method, some things that you might want to look at.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think the first thing is to say, it's kind of like it's been in the Q&A a bit, and also I think Marie kind of touched on this as well, is the idea that ethics shouldn't be a replacement for regulation, you know. And at the moment, I think that a lot of companies are equating ethics with compliance in some way. And actually, when you speak to people about, you know, what is AI ethics, they'll come back to you with a lot of things that are actually in the GDPR. You know, they'll say like transparency, accountability, and all of these things. And I think the key thing to say is here, and this is what I say, you know, you might be coming from academic institutions where ethics means something very different to you. Like I fundamentally specialize in ethics for profit and not-for-profit and charitable sectors, so non-academic sectors. And what I try and say is ethics should be kind of your competitive advantage. So you're not trying to replace regulation. You're not trying to, in fact, there should be better regulation. Let's be super clear on that. And that should go through the democratic process. We're in a democratic country. We don't want businesses to suddenly replace, they'd be like, oh no, we don't do need democracy because actually we've got these ethicists in the room. That's not the case. It's like ethics is using different methods from, you know, the humanities and the social scientists to create competitive advantage, because that should be where your products are differentiating, you know? Like at the moment, I don't know if anyone's come across this idea of closed world discourse, but at the moment, the way that we see AI is just so narrow. You know, we've got such narrow ideas of what technology could look like. And if you look at closed world discourse, it really has an amazing theory as to why that is the case. And actually what ethics should be doing is expanding out all of the possible scenarios, all the possible things that we're doing. And how can that not be competitive advantage? And aren't we living in a hyper-competitive world at the moment? This is then when I get in my sales mode, right? The cost of living crisis. We need innovation. We need to kind of like have policies, which means that you stand out compared to your competitors. So where do you get buy-in from ethics? There's, you know, I love the innovation angle. I love it because most tech companies think they're highly innovative, but I just see the same replication of the same tools again and again and again. The second one is, you know, I think it was in the Q&A, is managing your risk a little bit. Like ultimately the big fines from the ICO are about to start taking off. We've started to see the first class action policies where people are not complying with GDPR, so you do need to manage your risk. And the third one is around building trust. So how are you going to build trust with your stakeholders? That's a less tangible benefit, I think. Lots of people talk about trust but don't have a theory of trust. Another one of my little gripes. But so those are my three things around getting buy-in. Also just momentum. You know, like it's just a classic thing. Like if you are interested in ethics, find those 5 other people in your department who also care about ethics. Start a lunchtime book club or something. You meet up every month, and then that momentum translates into change. And I've seen this with some, you know, pulling out a great company that's done this. Sky created the Digital Ethics Network. They're called the Den, and then suddenly, you know, 18 months later, they started hiring their first digital ethicists. Like this really does work. So the buy-in is crucial, and everyone in this room has a part to play. Like, and it is super empowering. It's really exciting, and these are the positive news stories that we need.
Did anyone else have any kind of sidestep opinions on that sort of that question? Thanks, Alice. I want to pitch in.
Was this, sorry, this was about companies using ethics?
Yes, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so in my studies where I've spoken to these companies, they want to use it, they're not sure how to do it. When you say ethics to people, there's many different opinions of what that means. And so when you go to a company and you say, are you designing ethically? They might say yes, but what they're actually doing is something different to company B or company C. So there is no kind of defined way of how you can approach things ethically. But what I do in my work is say ethics is not impacting society in a negative way. And the way that you do that is through a process, through development. So companies are kind of getting used to that way of developing things. But where you've got short timescales and short amounts of funding, people are trying to develop things for the lowest cost and in the shortest time. And therefore, they're not the safest things that we're developing, but then they're going out there and they're live because they're the new shiny thing. So I think there's more to do, and I think it's more educational rather than regulation, because you can try and force people to do things like you can in an audit, but eventually they'll find loopholes, tick boxes, and do things in a way where it doesn't really help anybody. So I think education is the way forward with that.
Yeah, I think just reflecting off the back of that, from my lens of working a lot in kind of enterprise tech, right, and big tech, there's sort of this, I guess, top-down approach at the moment. I think you were scratching at this, Alice, as well, as like obviously the election of sort of AI ethics officers at big tech, right? I mean, this is something we're seeing commonly, and the implementation of a code of AI ethics at companies. But I think what's absent is this bottom-up, what Alice is talking about, right? This emergence from embedded teams around this topic. I see it personally myself as it needs to sort of come from where kind of human-centered design has already got its foot in the door with enterprise innovation. I think there's a bigger call to action now in sort of embedding this broader approach. And also, I can't escape what Alice said as well about the narrowness of our conception of AI in general. And I think this is where we fall over more often than not, is we have a very sort of, I think I mentioned it, like a monolithic view of like super intelligence, replicating human intelligence, making it very domain specific. Whereas I think we need to move into something that's a bit more like a constellation, right? And I think that needs to happen bottom up, with ethics embedded, like a governance from within, not just this sort of top down, board level ethics message that we're commonly seeing. So that's just my 10 cents on how I'm seeing it within sort of the tech and product side of things.
Sorry, can I just come in quickly? Because there was something I wanted to say, Ben, and I can't believe I haven't done this before as a philosopher, because we always like defining things really up front as well. And I really like that Marie gave her definition of ethics. And my definition of ethics, it's not just mine, it comes from obviously a lineage of many different philosophers, is that ethics is the study of how to live. So it's the study of how people should interact with each other, how people should interact with the environment, how people should interact with the environment. And it's the reason why it differs slightly from what Marie said is because it's not just about not causing harm. It's about creating structures that actually then enable people to thrive and enable us to thrive in environments. And also it kind of sticks to the idea that in Western ethics, because I'm not an expert in Shinto ethics or Ubuntu ethics, like there's so many different ethical kind of like frameworks, is that it can be deontological, which is action-based. It can be consequential, consequentialist, or utilitarian, which is consequential. It can be embedded in virtue ethic theory as well. So I can't believe that I didn't do that at the beginning. But I think also us acknowledging that, like, when we talk about ethics, we might all have very different ideas of what ethics is and then where we move forward. So that was just a little thing I wanted to say, because if without it, I'd kind of have to go and like rescind my profession, basically.
Can I just come back on that? That's what I just said is not my definition of ethics. It's the way that I explain it to people, because there is no way that I'm going to go and speak on all those different philosophical principles to a developer.
I think you'd give the developers an injustice. Maybe they want to hear it.
They might do, but that's going to cost a lot of money for the training session, you see, because that's a whole degree of philosophy.
Yeah. I think we're all beating around the bush about the fact that there is ethics and this way of thinking about this world we're living in, right? It's how do we actually implement stuff which has good outcomes because we're thinking ethically, we're building this future in a certain direction. We could be building it in a different direction, right? And it could be bad, but we're just using this ethical thinking to steer it over this way some more. That's the way, kind of like one of the ways I like to think of it is, we have all these options, how can we leverage the best situation that we possibly can? Hopefully not just for like profit, but for social good, cohesion, wellness, flourishing, all these interesting words. I'm going to come back to one of the things that you said, actually, Marie, if that's okay, which was around accreditation. I'm really interested in, it's been brought up before, and you mentioned it, and I haven't heard it being used for a little while. So I just wondered if you have a strong opinion about accreditation. There was also this idea about fact-checking the fact-checkers. That was one of the questions in the chat. And this idea of legislation coming in as well. I don't know if you have an opinion about legislating data ethics or data science?
Okay, so the accreditation, what I've developed over the last 10 years is this process on how to develop and build ethical AI, which is just generally, you know, good common sense, let's not impact everybody badly AI. And part of that is I'm launching a new AI accreditation where AI professionals can be accredited. This is partly to do with the level of respect that modelers do not have currently in business and government. So in order to get them that level, there is an accreditation coming out where you can be you can pass, and then you can say, I've, you know, gone through this framework of how I develop my AI. I can develop ethically, I understand the principles behind it, I understand how to develop well and to bring in different stakeholders, all the different steps which you might, you know, need to use in order to develop good technology. And then you can use that to go to a business and say, I am now qualified in this. And that's because when businesses are looking for people as well, they'll put out job adverts that say 30 years in Python and 50 years in C# or whatever, and it's like, well, actually, what does this mean? What does an AI, you know, developer look like? So we've defined what that actually looks like in today's world, alongside multiple businesses and universities, funding bodies, and the legal sector. And I think it's necessary because we need to be able to challenge our models. And when you're kind of getting put in charge of a model and maybe you've not got any evidence of your skills and qualifications in that particular area, because the university degrees give modules on data science and AI, but they don't necessarily give you a full degree in it. So it's difficult to say what you've actually done. So this just overarches that and helps people to be able to define what they can do and how they can do it. And they're held to a code of conduct and all that kind of good stuff that chartered professionals have. Legislation, I don't believe it's the answer. I believe it's something that we need to really think about. Before we do that, we need to understand what ethics are, what best practices, what modeling looks like, and what AI development looks like for the future. If you're going to do that, you need to make sure that people understand what it is that they're supposed to be doing in the first place, which is a massive gap in business currently. So I think that's down the line, but I think eventually it will be, you know, put into place. And what was the third question? There was the regulation and the accreditation and
It's checking the fact checkers.
checking the fact checkers. So yeah, some people have said it really good in the Q&A actually, who checks fact checkers. And the remit that social media platforms and the internet in general has got to fact check things and block you from saying things is absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, hate speech is not ideal in any way, but what has been found is that if you try and attack somebody's hate speech or try and convince them to do something else, they become more entrenched in their own worldview. So you need to educate them. And additionally, if you try to ban language or groups, what they'll do is kind of go underground and form somewhere else, and that will still continue, but it'll become even more radicalized because you've actually tried to, you know, you've backed it into a corner really. So my entire kind of thing about this is all about education, trying to educate people, trying to show people, you know, the problem is that if somebody's got a worldview, it costs a lot of effort for that person to change that worldview. And if you want them to do that, you have to spend a lot of time and they have to spend a lot of effort doing so. They get their worldview from when they're young, from people that they grow up with, from people that they admire. And that is then, you know, quite entrenched in what they do because the human mind wants the easiest way forward and is quite lazy in terms of updating its own beliefs and viewpoints. So it is difficult to do, but it is something that we should be combating with critical thinking and education, I think. But Alex, as well as I would imagine, has got a view on this.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So I think the fact checking question, first of all, who fact checks the fact checkers? I think any sort of fact checking organization that's worth its salt, sort of thing, I think that you would expect them to explain the reasoning behind the fact check within the fact check itself. So I think the answer to that is we all, as a society, fact check the fact check. Because if a fact checking organization makes a mistake, they should have sort of processes in place for a fact check to be challenged. And so that is one mechanism. I think there is also like accreditation, sorry. So like there are like the International Fact Checking Network, which is almost like a governing body or fact-checking organization that maintain a sort of basic standard of fact-checking, which is important. I think going back to the hate speech question, so I think there's a question about whether we want to change people's sort of worldview or stop them from harming others, sort of thing. I do appreciate this is like a very difficult topic, and I think it does come down to your worldview. So there isn't a right answer here, but I think for me personally, we don't want. I don't think anyone should be subjected to hate speech. I say that in quotation marks because there isn't like a single definition of hate speech. But I think there are broad overlaps between different definitions. So I think we do have enough there to sort of say this sort of piece of content is likely to be thought of as hate speech by 90% of the UK population, for example. And I think, yeah, we want to clean up sort of online discourse and remove cases where anyone is on the receiving end of such comments. But yeah, happy to hear anyone else's thoughts on that.
I think that's one of those ones that could keep running, and we should like have another session on just like that aspect of like cleaning up the web or cleaning up internet discourse. That's really interesting. Just that's a title, isn't it, for a session? So yeah, awesome. Did anyone have anything to add to that? I've got a few more questions I've got in my bag here. I'm seeing blank faces, so I'm going to keep going. So there's so much we could talk about, so I'm trying to get a good breadth of opinions. One of the things that we had at the beginning of this was the idea that people are using this technology now, right? And a lot of the people who will be in the audience will be using or thinking about or tinkering with algorithms, AI models, etc. And it's one of those questions where how visible or how transparent do you have to be is quite a pressing one for people using this technology. I don't know if people want to take that. What does that really mean for a business or a public sector company at the moment? How transparent, and what does that mean for them?
I can have a go at that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I imagine Sophia might have a few things to say about that as well.
You need to be completely transparent. There is no situation in my experience or that I've come across in academia or with complex models where you should be saying it's a black box and you don't know how it works and you're not sure what's happening, because if that's the case, then how are you putting that into society? That's dangerous. And I've seen models that people think the outcome is correct when actually the model's been doing something completely incorrect, and when it's been looked into, it's not worked correctly at all in the way that people perceived. So it was technically doing the right thing, but for the wrong reasons, and that's not what we want, because that can cause issues. So you need to be following best practice processes and making sure that what you're developing is fit for purpose and is not going to impact in a negative way on anybody at the end of it. And that means that you have to be 100% fully transparent with the entire process of build, testing, and implementation.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone have a subsequent follow-on for that?
Yeah, I guess just following on from, everything Marie said resonates, right? I think it's paramount in the development process, but also the deployment process as well. And I think this is where a lot of people become unstuck, because they think that just explainability ethics is where it ends. And it's actually having those sort of like feedback loops that come back in to kind of find, particularly around, like I'm going to say ChatGPT, right, in the tuning. But having that sort of mechanism that comes back in, that's not yet been articulated very well. So there's sort of I don't want to call it a lip service to transparency, but that's my sense of it. It's very much about the development process, but it's not about deployment and kind of iterating on the models. So I think being able to mobilize this idea of a participatory process where you're actually involving the citizenry in public services that it affects, right, and recalibrating the models is something we don't have a mechanism for at the moment. So it's more the operations of how do you do that well, how do you do that at scale, how do you do that across multiple domains? And I think we haven't quite scratched the surface yet of what that means, like transparency with action, right? So that's something I'm getting a sense of that we need to certainly evolve.
I'd love to follow up on that, actually, because I think you both made some really good points about the fact that transparency is kind of an instrumental good. Like, it's instrumental for, sorry, that's my next meeting coming up. It's instrumental for something else. And that instrumentalization could be accountability, or it could be trust. And for each of these things, like, transparency doesn't offer the full picture for you to get there. And there is like a real focus on transparency. And I think that, Alex, you know, quite a lot of what you're doing is around that transparency, right? Is making sure that people have enough information. Everything you just said about the fact checkers and the fact checkers that are worth their salt are engaging in transparent practices. But, you know, you can't say the buck stops there. You need to think of it as instrumental for something else, as opposed to like what we call an intrinsic good. So an intrinsic good is good in and of itself, and for that you might say freedom or justice or peace or love or something, whereas transparency is instrumental. So that's all I'll say in this brief time.
So we're going to get to peace and love AIs pretty soon. That's what I'm aiming for. That's where we're going. Thanks, Alice. So I think I might come back to you if that's okay. There's this idea that we've been playing around in the questions as well, and we've been talking about ethics, and we've been deciding that it has this business application and that we should be thinking about our social impacts and outcomes and all these sorts of things, and we have some tools that we can use to do that. But there's this question around higher level thinking, you know, is there certain aspects that we should actually not use this technology at all because it is too detrimental? How will we know, essentially, if that is the case? You know, who is in charge of making these decisions? And it appears that, you know, business are in charge of making this decision at the moment. So I find that whole kind of existential idea of where we're headed and in whose hands are we headed with quite interesting.
How much time have we got? Just
yeah,
small
indeed.
Okay, I think there are a couple of technologies which shouldn't really be developed. I think the one that I think there's pretty much unanimity. I don't know. It's unanimous in kind of like the field is facial recognition, in the fact that that is a technology that should not really be deployed at all. It should not be used at all. And with that, then kind of emotional recognition and these kind of technologies as well. Whenever you say that, you always have someone come up with a really niche example, super niche, like facial recognition is actually really good at identifying early stroke patients or something. You know, when you're just like, okay, but that's then contained in such a small sphere, you know, that's fine to keep that as an exception. But I think facial recognition is generally shouldn't be in operation at all. And I know that there's some other foundational research areas where a lot of academics will be like, oh, you know, it's just foundational research. Like, we don't know what the applications are going to be yet, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, I think we're pretty sure what the applications are going to be. And actually, the funding of these things should be kind of considered, because it's not just business, it is also academics, which then admittedly are then funded by private interests and stuff. But this is basically very complicated space. So hopefully I've done justice to that question in 90 seconds. But yeah, I think that facial recognition is a prime example of the sorts of technology that should just definitely not be used.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, I remember there being a Kaggle competition, right? And it really struck me about this Kaggle competition that the challenge was to take a face and recognize similarities to a subsequent face to whether they were related, right? And on the face of it, this was quite an interesting challenge. But then you look at the organization running it, and the people who are financing that organization, and the kind of lack of, like, let's say, details around where the data's coming from, what they're going to be subsequently using the research for, and you get a bit unstuck with, you know, actually this is probably a very dubious you know, thing that we've got up here, and can we challenge that this should exist at all? And I think it's sort of striking and awful that things can pop up in all sorts of places like that. And I think you can have your own ideas around it, but like you say, I think there are some things which are almost too detrimental, and you might find, you know, if you're going to go utilitarian, the weight of the bad outcomes outweighs the good in some of these instances. So that's definitely something that I've experienced anyway. Did anyone else have anything else?
It kind of depends, I think, who is using the technology and what for. You know, if you've got an Alexa, some people have been really disadvantaged by those because they've taken their data and then they've linked things up on Facebook to, you know, there was a sex worker, her profession got linked up on Facebook, and all the people that she was doing business with were actually linked to her. And the problem with that was all of her family was on Facebook and they didn't know that she was doing this, and she didn't want them to know. But the privacy element was taken out of her life because the data was kind of put together. And this is something that's happening more and more. Databases are being linked and the consequences are not being looked at of what the predictive analytics of that might be. And so I think it just depends, you know, it might be good that you've got an Alexa if you're not very mobile and you want to do certain things and it helps you to use a voice recognition agent, but it might not be good if you want to have to go through all the different privacy settings and try and protect what it is that you're actually, you know, what your data is. So there's advantages and disadvantages to it all. And again, consumers have got to be really understanding of what happens to their data, how these, you know, how the technology works, and what the outcome of that might actually be for them.
Well, we're coming up to just about 9 minutes left. There's been loads of activity actually from the panelists here on the question and answers. So if you actually have asked a question, you might have some answers, or if you haven't been looking at it at all, check it out, because there is some really great thoughts from our panelists on there, which may not transition onto the video. That's what I'm afraid of. So we're coming up to a final question, but before that, I was wondering if we could quickly explore the unlearning, because I just thought that was really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about how one unlearns things?
I assume that's coming at me for the Miguel comment. So I find this really interesting, and it's not something I think has been given a lot of airtime, is this idea of deep unlearning. I mean, I'm coining this term now, right? Because that's how I'm thinking about it. But it is an interesting fact, because I think it comes back to this idea around like the semantic discontinuity with data, right? And rights over data when it's aggregated, which is something that is not currently regulated. Is, you know, when data is transformed and applied to infer certain, you know, decision rights, etc., like what's the data owner's kind of rights within that? So there's already that kind of core layer that hasn't been addressed. Then add to it the complexity of when your data is, whether it's a photo of your face, your voice, whatever, it's been used to aggregate some sort of, you know, neural net that learns on a pool of, you know, a plethora, like in the millions of data. And you might say, well, okay, well, removing, you know, my face from that learned information, that neural net has no implication on the output, which is probably true, depending on the size of the data set. But how do you actually unpick and regress that? I mean, I have not seen any research around this, and I find this fascinating. And I think it speaks to also the traceability of, you know, deep learning in itself and how this works. But I think it poses the broader, more accessible question, I think, of aggregation logic, and how things are transfigured in the services that we're using, and what it means for the origins of where this information is coming from, potential misinformation as well. So it really brought my attention, because those are the sort of conversations I don't see happening enough. And I think we need that discourse around understanding it as well, and how embedded and entrenched some of these data sources are in kind of the amazing but very, very intimidating technologies we're fast seeing evolve. It's like we need an actor-critic method for our own sort of societal understanding of these things, which we don't have. And maybe this is where the ethicists will sort of drive this new paradigm shift. So yeah, I find it a really interesting speculation and thought experiment, but interested to get these guys' thoughts on it.
If I'm going to give my 2 cents, I think it ties into that plagiarism thing that I was referring to earlier on as well. So if you were able to ask the question of the model, how much did my images or how much did my data come into the output of this specific thing, then you could maybe monetize your data in that way in these models, or you could at least know, or like there's things that you could do there, or you could, like you say, somehow unpick that data, train it against that data so it's negatively correlated with that output. So there are things that you could do, but I think I don't have a good view onto the kind of materials, the research that's happening, because there's just these models are vast, right? So I think the amount of training and interesting work there is going to take a little while to trickle through to actually see some outcomes.
If anyone in our audience knows any amazing research in this space, please drop the papers in the chat, because I'd be fascinated. And I love how you phrased it like noise cancelling of neural nets, like find the antiphase and then negate it. There's something in that. I think it's super interesting. Anyway, I'll be quiet now on unlearning.
So I'm worried at the time. These conversations can last for hours, and I wish they would. So thank you to all our panelists. If you would leave us all with kind of like, there's, nearly half of the people in the audience have said in the poll that they are working in this area. They're working in data science, and they may or may not use ethical frameworks or kind of methods. Or they're at least interested in this area because they're online and watching us right now. What can you leave those people with? If you're tempted to do something, one thing right now, what would that one thing be? Whether it's looking at something, listening to something, going and doing something, what kinds of things would you advise? And I'll start with whoever's ready, I guess. So.
Okay, so I've kind of got 2 sides to this. I think maybe I'm a bit biased against my own kind of positioning as well, but put yourself in a team of multidisciplinarians, anti-disciplinarians, right? I think me just being on this panel has been so insightful to be around such a diversity of voices. And I think within the engineering community and the digital community, we don't have enough kind of heterogeneity on the team. And that was kind of what I was speaking to in my lightning talk, right? Is kind of these new research cultures. They urgently need to happen. So find people that cover all of these different dimensionalities, right? And start conversations with them. And then secondly, I would try and plug a little bit the example I gave around this AI research project for global climate cooperation. Take an interest in it, take a peek at it. I shared my GitHub link, which shares some of the models that are going to drive that. It's super interesting. I think it's where we can see research communities across anthropology, across ethicists, across data scientists, across designers coming together to take on really big policy and economic challenges. So I would encourage you just to have a peek at what's going on there. There's some really interesting people involved. And attend more of these discussions. I found this super insightful. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Marie?
It's not very often I get to have a really good discussion with people on this topic, so I've really enjoyed today. I like listening to the new kind of things that have been developed in the area as well. So I'm going to go and check out a few things that Sophia has been talking about. And I think I could probably talk to Alice in a pub over about 1 million drinks about philosophy, and we could argue all day long. And I've really learned from Alex as well about what, fact checking is, what's going on and how it should be. I can't remember what Alex said, but it was about looking at, when you're fact checking, you need to be able to know what you're talking about before you can fact check it. And that really kind of struck a chord, because I thought that's really what needs to happen. So thanks for that.
And Alex.
Was that Alex or Alex?
Yeah, sorry, Alex. Yes, you're right.
Okay, yeah. Cool. Yeah, so just in response to your question, Ben, I think one thing that I want people to take away from this is the concept of red teaming. And it's a concept from cybersecurity, and it's basically an exercise where you put on the cap of someone that could potentially use your algorithms for malicious purposes. I think it's a really useful exercise that is especially useful in applications like hate speech detection, where you're thinking about making these algorithms more visible, perhaps, but you do need to think about how that can be misused and stuff like that. But red teaming has applications pretty much anywhere. So yeah, that's what I want people to take away.
Alice.
Hello.
Thank you.
Marie's not doing too much for the reputation of philosophers, about 1 million drinks in a pub. I think we're trying to get rid of that reputation, actually. But sure, let's do it. Absolutely.
I'm more than happy to keep that reputation.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's happened again. What would I say is the best takeaway? Like, generally these, like, we talk about these jobs, they don't actually really exist at the moment. Like, have a Google search open for ethics jobs, you will see them. They're generally quite mid-managementy senior. If you are currently working in a company, make that job happen for yourself. You know, put that into your objectives. Show, like, attend these events, pick up some books. My favorite books that I'm recommending all the time to the moment is Stephanie Hare's Technology is Not Neutral. Is an excellent introduction. I'm sure that everyone has some really good books. I love Tarleton Gillespie's content moderation books on custodian of the internet, for instance. Environmentalism and AI, you've got Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI. Like, there's so many resources available. So you just, put it into your own objectives and own that domain. And I'm telling you, that is going to be really hard. So I've just told you something that's probably going to take you like a year to 18 months to achieve. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is when you get there, make sure you are paid the same amount as a data scientist. Otherwise, you will not be taken as seriously. Our skills are so, you heard me list off all the things that the things that we need to be able to do. That job description should be paid the same amount as data scientists. So value yourself, do the best you can, celebrate the small wins and make the job happen. And yeah, I'm sure everyone on this panel would love to hear from you because we love supporting people who are trying to get into it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is the end. We're going to drop our mics shortly. Thank you very much to our panelists. Again, we just keep going and we're just going to go to the pub now, right? So we'll see you all there, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one of these. The next one will be next week, but also the next ethics one, which we'll have, I imagine, in the next 6 months or so. Thanks for everyone. Thanks for the Data Science Festival for putting us on. And if you want to access the video from this session, they'll be distributed to you and they'll be available on the website. Again, thanks for everyone, guys, and we'll see you again in the future.